The phone call came while I was sitting on the garden bench at the nursing home feeding the pigeons. The October wind carried the damp of the Charles River and made my bad knee throb. My phone buzzed 3 times before I answered, and it was my son Brian on the other end. I could hear the barely contained triumph in his voice even through the tinny speaker. "Dad, good news," he said. In the background, I could make out the low rumble of a yacht engine. "I went ahead and handled that house of yours. Got a decent price for it. Lucy's been wanting a 40-footer for ages, and there was a used one at the marina that came up this morning. We're taking delivery this afternoon." My hand tightened around the phone, but it didn't shake. These hands had spent 37 years in the Navy, gripping helm wheels in the firelight of the Persian Gulf and holding coffee cups in the map rooms of the Pentagon. They didn't shake over a phone call. Still, my voice dropped half an octave. "Which house?" Brian laughed. I knew that laugh too well. It was the same sound he made when he was 7 years old and swiped my collection of World War II medals to trade for baseball cards. "Which one do you think?" "The Beacon Street place. You're not using it stuck out there at the home, and Lucy said the location was just wasted equity sitting there. Better to liquidate." He paused, then added, "Hey, don't get worked up, Dad. I set aside $30,000 for you. That should cover another 10 years at the home. Easy. $30,000. I owned 3 properties in the Boston Harbor District, and that Beacon Street townhouse alone pulled in $8,700 a month in rent. And my son, my only heir, had just sold it off for barely half its value to buy his wife a fiberglass yacht." "Brian," I said, and I could hear my own jaw tightening around the word. "Did you read the transfer documents all the way to the last page?" The line went quiet for a couple of seconds. Then came the rustle of paper being flipped, followed by his breathing, which had gone abruptly stiff. "What is this?" he asked, the smugness cracking at the edges. "What kind of trust clause is this?" I didn't answer. I hung up just as the dinner bell started ringing at the nursing home. I stood up slowly and scattered the rest of my breadcrumbs to the pigeons. Old Tom, wheezing in his wheelchair nearby, called over, "Frank, you arguing with your kid again?" I gave him a small smile and started walking toward the dining hall. I kept my back straight as I walked. That was a Navy habit I never lost. The television in the corner of the cafeteria was running CNN, and the screen showed a live shot from the Boston South Bay Marina. A sleek new white sailboat was sliding into the water, its stern painted in gold lettering. Lucy's dream. That my phone buzzed again. This time the number was unfamiliar, but the area code was the Maritime Authority exchanged, Frank Harper. A young woman's voice came through, crisp and direct, the way dockworkers talk. "This is Megan Kavanaugh, the dockmaster at South Bay Marina. A new vessel just tied up at your slip number 3. Registration shows the owner as Brian Harper. I need to confirm your renewal for the slip lease." "No renewal." I cut in, keeping my voice steady. "Slip 3 converts to a commercial fishing dock starting tomorrow. And while I have you, can you pull the current market value on that boat for me?" There was a brief silence on her end, then the tap of a keyboard. "Sir, that boat is a used Gulfstream 40-footer, fully fitted with navigation gear and fishing package. Market estimate, about $220,000. I closed my eyes. The Beacon Street house had appraised at $970,000 last year. Brian had let it go for $350,000, and he'd even skipped the broker's fee. And now he was out there on that boat with Lucy, both of them probably toasting their brilliant deal. "Megan," I said, opening my eyes and staring at the ceiling fan spinning lazily above the cafeteria tables. "I need you to do me a favor. Tomorrow morning at 8, deliver a dockage invoice to the new owner at Slip 3. Use the commercial rate, $1,200 a day." I paused, then added, "And tell him he's got barnacles on the hull." Megan let out a low chuckle, like she understood exactly what I was getting at. "Got it, sir. And speaking of that, there's something you might find interesting. The Port Authority just passed a new Historic Vessel Protection Act this afternoon. Any civilian vessel registered for more than 25 years, if the original owner files a claim, qualifies for full docking subsidies and priority operational rights." My fingers tightened on the phone. 25 years ago, I had spent 2 full years refitting the Bluefin, an old dragger fishing boat I'd kept after I left the Navy. She'd been sitting in the Port Authority's abandoned vessel section ever since, waiting for me to find the cash to repaint her. But I'd kept the lease on that salvage slip active all these years. I'd paid the minimum fee out of my own pocket every 12 months like clockwork. When does the act go into effect? I asked. 3 o'clock this afternoon. The governor signed it. Megan's voice held the faintest trace of a smile. Haven't seen it on the news yet. I ended the call and picked up a tray to join the dinner line. The cook lady scooped mashed potatoes onto my plate and asked if I wanted extra gravy. I said yes. On the television, the CNN anchor was reading the newswire. The new measure is expected to benefit over 300 aging fishing vessels, with owners eligible for subsidies based on original registration documents. Experts suggest that some of these boats may have historic value far exceeding their current market price. I chewed my mashed potatoes slowly, smiling into the clatter of trays and forks in the noisy cafeteria. The next morning, before the sun was fully up, I took the old Ford from the nursing home lot out onto Route 95. In the passenger seat sat a brown paper envelope containing the things I'd pulled from the metal box under my bed. The Bluefin's original registration, her refit logs from back in '98, and a receipt so faded you could barely make out the ink, the receipt said. June 1998, Frank Harper donated 4 sets of World War II naval navigation instruments to the Massachusetts Maritime Museum. The director at the time had shaken my hand and said, "Harper, these are worth more than money." I'd said that was fine, let the kids learn history from them. When I called the museum, the archivist on the phone actually gasped. 2 of those navigation sets were prototype units used by the fleet during the Normandy landings, and the museum had been hunting for the matching paperwork for 17 years. The receipt I had, on the back side, had the serial numbers jotted down in my mother's handwriting. "Mr. Harper," the archivist said, his voice suddenly twice as respectful. "If you file for historic vessel certification now, we can issue an official appraisal document. Do you understand what that means for you?" I understood. It meant the Bluefin was no longer a rusting old tub. She was a national maritime heritage asset. And under the new law, heritage vessels got permanent, free dockage, along with priority management rights over all surrounding commercial slips. At South Bay Marina had 47 slips total. Slips 3 through 7 were the prime real estate, pulling in over $800,000 a year in combined rent. And my son's fancy new sailboat was sitting right in the middle of them, taking up space it had no right to. I pulled into the South Bay lot at exactly 7:40 in the morning. The fog was still hanging low over the water, and I could just make out the white hull of Lucy's Dream through the mist. A woman in a red windbreaker was standing on the dock, and she waved as I got out. "Megan, Mr. Harper." She walked over and handed me a hot cup of coffee. "Your son and his wife slept on the boat last night. I slipped the invoice onto the cleat when I went by this morning. They hadn't woken up yet." I took the coffee and looked past her. A brand new white dock line was tied to the bollard at slip 3, and next to it, Megan had taped up the yellow payment notice. The paper fluttered in the salt breeze like a warning flag. "I had a diver check the hull," Megan added quietly. "You were right about the barnacles. Heavy infestation. Looks like the previous owner kept her in tropical waters for a while. If that growth isn't scraped, the hull plate corrosion will accelerate fast. Clean out will run at least 12 grand, and she'll need a dry dock haul out." I nodded. Just then the cabin door of Lucy's Dream swung open, and Brian emerged in a bathrobe, his hair a mess, holding the payment notice in one hand. When he spotted me standing on the dock, he froze like he'd been nailed to the deck. "Dad," his voice was hoarse. "What are you doing here? What is this bill?" I walked to the edge of the pier, coffee in hand, and looked across the 5 feet of water at him. Brian's face was turning red. Behind him, Lucy poked her head out, still sleepy, clutching a scarf around her neck. When she saw me, her eyes flickered with something like panic for half a second, then settled back into that polished, efficient expression she wore like armored. "Frank, I think there's been some misunderstanding," she said, her voice honey-sweet. "Brian told me the house was yours, but since he's your only heir, it made sense to handle things early. If you're upset, we can talk about it." I looked into her eyes. This woman had been married to my son for 8 years, had lived in that townhouse for 4, and she'd never once invited me to dinner. Last Thanksgiving I'd brought over a pie, and she'd told me the oven was broken down. "Lucy," I said, "that house was my mother's. She put it in her will with a very clear condition. The property was for family use only and could not be sold. When you and Brian signed the transfer papers, did your real estate lawyer bother to read the last page?" There's a non-transfer clause. Brian's face went pale. He spun around and ducked back into the cabin, and half a minute later he re-emerged with a stack of papers in his hands. What clause? I read every page, from top to bottom. Last page, I repeated. Brian's fingers flipped frantically to the end, and then his voice just died. The clause was printed in 8-point font at the very bottom, next to my mother's scanned signature. It stated, if the property is involuntarily transferred during the lifetime of Frank Harper, the transfer is automatically void, and title reverts to the original holder. Any third party profiting from such a transfer must remit all proceeds and cover associated legal costs. Brian's hands were trembling. Lucy leaned over to read the text, and the blood drained from her face too. A few old-timers who were setting up crab pots on the nearby dock turned to stare, curiosity plain on their weathered faces. That's when Megan's phone rang. She answered, listened for a few seconds, and then looked at me with a grin. Mr. Harper, that was the museum. The appraisal documents just came through by electronic fax to the Port Authority. The Bluefin's registration status is now officially changed to National Heritage Vessel. Congratulations, sir. Brian was still standing on the deck of Lucy's Dream, staring at the document in his hands. The papers slipped from his grip and fluttered down onto the water's surface. The yellow payment notice, caught by the wind, peeled off the bollard and drifted lazily through the air until it landed on the sailboat's deck, right over the gold lettering on the stern. For the next 3 days, Brian did not call me. I figured he was busy talking to lawyers. The old-timers down at South Bay Marina, though, they had plenty to say. Every morning when I showed up for my walk along the docks, someone would sidle up and ask if that fancy white sailboat was still sitting there. It was. Megan had been posting a fresh invoice every single day at dawn. $1,200 a day for dockage, plus garbage fees and electrical hookup charges. By the third morning, the total had climbed to $4,800. Brian tried to fire up the engine and move the boat out, but the entry gate arm at the marina would not lift. His dock access had been frozen because I had suspended his slip privileges under my management authority over the Heritage Zone. On the fourth day, I got a call from a legal advisor at the Boston Port Authority. The man on the line was polite, but his message was pointed. Brian Harper had filed a grievance claiming that my billing for Slip 3 constituted retaliatory pricing, an abuse of my position as the Bluefin's manager. Mr. Harper, the lawyer said, by regulation, we need to hold a hearing within 5 business days. You will need to provide a reasonable basis for your fee structure. I told him that would not be a problem. After I hung up, I called the museum and asked for a full maintenance budget for the Bluefin. The director himself answered, and he told me he had something to discuss with me anyway. The state was planning to establish a maritime heritage exhibition zone in Boston Harbor, and the Bluefin had been selected as the first vessel for the display. As part of the package, operational management of the exhibition zone would be granted directly to the vessel's owner. In plain terms, the director said, his voice dropping to a confidential murmur, you can contract a block of slips from the Port Authority, run small exhibits, and tourist visits. The annual budget allocation is about $150,000, which is not huge, but you would also have the right to sublease the commercial slips in that block. I did the math in my head. Slips 3 through 7 fell right inside the planned exhibition zone. $150,000 in state funding, plus sublease revenue, would easily top $300,000 a year. And Brian's sailboat was occupying one of those prime spots, paying more per day than my monthly nursing home bill. The morning of the hearing, I put on a clean plaid shirt and drove to the Port Authority building. Brian was already there, sitting at the opposing table in a new suit that looked like he had bought it the day before. Next to him was a female lawyer with gold-rimmed glasses. Lucy was not with him. Brian himself looked thinner than he had a week ago, dark circles under his eyes. Like he had not slept much. The lawyer opened with a polished argument. She claimed I was using my heritage vessel management status to punish my own son, in violation of the port's fair business practices. I sat across from her and listened without interrupting. Then I pulled 3 documents out of my brown envelope and slid them across the table. The first document was the Bluefin's original registration, showing that I had bought her in 1987 with the last of the inheritance my mother had left me. The second document was the donation receipt for the navigation instruments, complete with the museum's embossed seal. The third document was the Massachusetts Maritime Authority's Historic Value Assessment Report, which contained a single sentence that said everything. The Bluefin and its onboard equipment hold unique significance in the history of World War II naval communications, and its historic value is irreplaceable. I pushed all 3 documents to the center of the table. The lawyer on the other side picked up the assessment report, flipped through it, and then glanced at Brian. I had seen that look too many times in too many proceedings. It was the look of someone who knew they had already lost. Mr. Harper's fee structure is entirely justified, the hearing officer said after reviewing the materials. Under Article 12 of the new Act, heritage vessel managers hold priority pricing authority over commercial operations in adjacent slips. The $1,200 daily rate for Slip 3 falls within reasonable commercial range. The grievance is denied. Brian shot to his feet, his chair scraping hard against the tile floor. Dad, you cannot do this. That boat is Lucy's. We paid cash for it. I looked at him. 48 years old, and the lines on his forehead were deeper than mine at 73. His temples were gray, and his suit sleeves were a little too short, like he had borrowed it from someone. For a moment, I thought about the year his mother died. He was 12. He had wrapped his arms around my leg and begged me not to leave. Then I shipped him off to his aunt's place in Maine while I went back to sea duty. 7 years he stayed there. Brian, I said, you bought that boat with the money from selling my mother's house. Can you still get that money back? He froze. The lawyer beside him muttered something about reserving the right to appeal the transfer clause. Go ahead, I said. But let me tell you one thing. The buyer of that townhouse is my old Navy buddy's nephew. He knew about the non-transfer clause before he signed. He bought it specifically because he was counting on the property reverting back to me, so he could negotiate a new lease. Which side do you think he is on? Brian's face crumpled. The hearing officer banged the gavel and called the session closed. I gathered my documents and started walking toward the door. Brian caught up to me in the hallway and grabbed my sleeve. His hand was shaking. Dad, he said, his voice scraping like sandpaper. Can you at least let the boat move Lucy? She is pregnant. She cannot keep living on that thing. The barnacles make it rock all night long, and she has been sick. I stopped. I turned around and looked at him. There was something glistening in his eyes, maybe tears, maybe just the fluorescent light reflecting off the hallway. But his grip on my sleeve was tight, and his knuckles were white. I will have the barnacles scraped, I said. The cost comes out of next month's dock revenue. But Brian, I already signed a 20-year lease on that townhouse. You and your wife need to find your own place to live. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. I turned and walked away. When I pushed through the Port Authority doors and stepped outside, the October sun hit my face, warm and bright. Seagulls wheeled overhead, crying their long, raucous cries against the blue sky. The news traveled faster than I expected. 3 days later, the local Boston paper ran a piece in the harbor section with the headline, "Veteran Fights Back: How an Old Boat and a Fine Print Clause Reversed a Family Fortune." They ran a photo of me standing on the Bluefin's rusty deck, holding a faded navigation chart. The old-timers at the nursing home went crazy over it. Old Tom told everyone within earshot that he had eaten dinner with Frank Harper every night for 4 years. Nobody believed him, because before the article came out, he had never once mentioned my name. At lunch, a few of the ladies who usually ignored me carried their trays over and asked if that boat was really making money. I told them it would buy me a new knee. It would actually buy about 20 new knees. After the museum budget cleared, the Bluefin went into dry dock for a full restoration. I went down to watch them paint her. Watching that old rust bucket emerge from the shed with her deep blue hull gleaming again, something inside me felt like it was slowly unwinding. The yard crew painted new lettering on the stern, Bluefin, Boston. Same font she had worn 35 years ago. Brian stayed quiet during those weeks. But Megan told me that Lucy's dream had been moved to the far end of the commercial slips, paying $600 a day for a less desirable spot. Lucy's pregnancy was real, Megan said. She had seen her leaning over the rail one morning looking green, with Brian standing behind her holding a mug of warm water. My lawyer called to say the property reversion had been processed. The buyer, my buddy's nephew, had signed a new 20-year lease at the original pre-sale price, with payments going directly into a trust account I controlled. The day the first deposit hit, I sat on the nursing home garden bench for a long time, watching the boats go by on the river, thinking about my mother sitting on the front porch of that townhouse knitting sweaters. She had knit sweaters her whole life. She knitted everything into them, even that fine print clause she had asked a lawyer to draft the year before she died. I had told her it was unnecessary. She had said, "You do not understand. People always find ways to go after money to..." She was right. On the 10th day, Brian showed up at the nursing home. He came alone, not in a suit, but in a worn khaki jacket with pills on the sleeves. He stood outside the garden gate, smoking half a cigarette before he finally walked in. I stayed on the bench and watched him approach. His steps were slower than before, and his shoulders sagged. "Dad," he said, and sat down next to me. The wooden bench creaked. A few pigeons startled and flew up before settling back down to peck at the ground. I pulled a handful of breadcrumbs from my pocket and scattered them. The pigeons hesitated, then returned to pecking. "Lucy had a baby girl," Brian said, his voice barely above a whisper. 2 weeks early. She is still in the NICU. We were thinking of naming her Margaret. Mom's name. My hand stopped mid-motion over the breadcrumbs. Margaret. My wife's name. Brian's mother. 36 years gone from breast cancer. Brian had been 12 when she left, crying himself to sleep for weeks after the funeral. "The doctors say she will be fine," Brian went on, rubbing a loose thread on his jacket sleeve. "Just needs some quiet time to grow. We are staying in the dockmaster's dormitory for now. Megan found us a unit. $700 a month, heat included." He fell silent after that. The wind blew off the river, and he hunched his shoulders. I noticed for the first time that the sweater he was wearing under that jacket had a frayed cuff. Dark blue yarn, exactly the shade my mother used to knit. "Your mother used to say babies need quiet," I said, my voice rougher than I expected. "You had asthma as a kid. She sat by your bed every night reading Navy stories to you until you fell asleep." Brian's nostrils flared. He did not look up, but I saw his jaw trembled. "About the boat," he started. "I am not getting involved in the boat," I said. "But you signed that dock contract yourself. You negotiate with Megan. She is in charge." He nodded slowly, like he had expected that answer. He sat with me for a while longer, then stood up and brushed the breadcrumbs off his pants. He took 2 steps toward the gate, then stopped. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a manila envelope, which he set down on the bench beside me. "This is what is left from selling the boat," he said. $3,200. I know it is not enough, but he did not finish. I picked up the envelope and weighed it in my hand. It was thick. I opened the flap and looked inside. Not a check, but cash. Stacks of $20 bills, old and worn, held together with rubber bands. "Brian," I called out. He turned back. His eyes were red-rimmed. "When your daughter has her 1-month checkup," I said, "bring her down to the marina. The Bluefin's wheelhouse is warm. It is better than a dormitory." He stared at me for a long moment. Then he smiled. It was a smile I had not seen in a very long time. The last time I saw it was when he was 12 years old, running across the base dock to grab my hand, and asked me if I would tell him about Normandy. I had said yes. "When you were older," I never told him. And then I ended up in the nursing home. December in Boston cut right through you. The wind came off the harbor with a bite that found every gap in your coat, every loose button, every worn patch of wool. But the South Bay Marina was strung with Christmas lights anyway, red and green and blue, reflecting off the thin layer of ice that had formed along the edges of the slips. The Bluefin's restoration was finished on a Tuesday morning, and when I stepped into her wheelhouse for the first time in 25 years, the heat from the refurbished diesel engine rose up through the deck plates and warmed the soles of my boots. The museum people were there. The Port Authority people were there. A couple of local television crews had set up their tripods on the main dock, and their cameras were aimed at the Bluefin's freshly painted hull. Megan had arranged for a full slip clearance. Slips 3 through 7 were cordoned off with red barrier tape, and behind the tape, maybe 30 or 40 local residents had gathered to watch. I cranked the old diesel. The roar that came out of that engine was thick and low, the same note I remembered from 35 years ago. The gauges on the dashboard had all been replaced, but they jumped and held steady just like the originals. It felt like a heart waking up. A reporter shoved a microphone toward my face. "Mr. Harper, we understand your Bluefin has now been designated a national heritage vessel. You have also reclaimed your family property through the trust clause and are now operating a commercial heritage zone. What would you like to say to the public?" I looked straight into the lens. Behind me, the Bluefin's deep blue hull caught the reflections of the Christmas lights strung along the dock. Far off in the commercial section, tucked into a corner slip, I could make out the white shape of Lucy's dream. The gold lettering on her stern was starting to look a little worn from the salt air. "One thing," I said. "A long time ago, when I was in the Navy, an old chief taught me something. Every line on a ship has a place it belongs. You tie it wrong, the first big wind comes along and the boat drifts. But you tie it right, no storm blows it loose." The reporter blinked, probably not understanding what I meant. That was fine. I was not expecting them to get it. Someone on the dock called my name. It was old Tom, still in his wheelchair, pushed up to the barrier tape by one of the nursing home aides. He gave me a thumbs up. I waved back. After the ribbon cutting, the crowd slowly thinned. I walked along the dock at my own pace, letting the cold air clear my head. When I reached the commercial section, I saw Brian standing on the deck of Lucy's Dream, bent over and working on a mooring line. Next to him stood Lucy, her hair cut short now, her face bare of the careful makeup she used to wear. She looked different. Softer, maybe. In her arms, she held a small bundle wrapped in a thick blue blanket. I walked closer. Brian straightened up and saw me. "Dad," he said. His voice was quiet, but it did not have the old edge to it. Lucy turned and said the same thing, and her voice was a few notes lower than I remembered. She did not sound like honey anymore. She sounded real. The baby in her arms shifted and let out a tiny whimper. One little hand came free of the blanket, and I saw that Lucy had wrapped her in dark blue wool, the same shade my mother used to knit. "We sold the boat," Brian said, pointing down at the deck beneath his feet. "Closing is next week. The buyer is a fish farm operator from Maine. He did not pay much, but it is enough for a security deposit on a small apartment. We found a place in Dorchester. Nothing fancy, but it has heat and a backyard." I nodded. Lucy shifted the baby to her other arm and looked at me for a moment before speaking. "Dad," she said, and the word came out like she had practiced it. "Thank you. Megan told us you were the one who arranged the dormitory unit for us." I did not confirm it. I did not deny it either. The wind picked up, and I pulled my scarf tighter around my neck. I looked at the white sailboat, the one that had caused all this trouble. There was a red sticker on the stern now, covering up the Lucy's Dream lettering. It said "for sale." "You can change the name," I said. "The new owner might let you." Brian stared at me for a long second. Then he smiled, and this time the smile reached his eyes. The lines around them crinkled, and for just a moment he looked like the 12-year-old boy I remembered. He glanced down at the baby in Lucy's arms and said, "When Margaret is old enough to learn about boats, I want to bring her down to the Bluefin." "You think you could teach her, Dad?" I looked at him. 36 years had passed since he asked me that same question. I had never given him an answer. "Yeah," I said, "when she is a little older." Then I turned and started walking back along the dock. The Christmas lights were coming on in the twilight, and the harbor glittered with red and green reflections. My knee ached with every step, but I kept my back straight. In my pocket, my phone buzzed with a text from Megan. She had sent a summary. Spring exhibition sponsors confirmed, 7 companies, total $90,000 in funding. And a new sublease had been signed for one of the Heritage Zone slips. The quarterly deposit into my account was just over $42,000. I did not reply. I shoved the phone back into my pocket and kept walking. The nursing home was having a Christmas dinner that night. Roast turkey and cranberry sauce. Old Tom had been talking about it for a week. I planned to go back, change into a clean shirt, and maybe hang the rest of my old medals on the mantelpiece in the common room. After all, there was going to be a little girl visiting someday. She would want to see them. I reached the end of the dock and turned back for one last look. The Bluefin sat quiet in the dusk, her blue paint glowing faintly under the dock lights. An old boat, tied to the right cleat, with a knot that had taken 36 years to undo. The wind blew hard across the harbor, but the boat did not drift. Later that week, I got a call from the archivist at the museum. He said the State Historical Commission had approved an additional grant for the Bluefin's exhibition program. They wanted to install a small interpretative center in the wheelhouse, with display panels about the Normandy navigation instruments and the role of civilian fishing vessels in wartime supply chains. The archivist asked if I would be willing to give occasional talks to school groups. I told him I would think about it. The day after Christmas, Brian showed up at the nursing home again. This time he had Lucy with him, and Lucy had Margaret in the blue blanket. The baby was tiny, her face scrunched up and red, but her eyes were open and alert. Brian held her while Lucy signed the visitor log at the front desk. I met them in the garden. It was cold, but the sun was out, and the snow on the riverbank sparkled. Brian handed me the baby without asking. I took her carefully, the way I had learned to hold things that mattered. She weighed almost nothing. She stared up at me with those pale newborn eyes, and for a moment I could not breathe. She looks like her grandmother, I said. Lucy came closer and tucked the blanket tighter around the baby's feet. We found some old photos in the attic of the Dorchester place. Brian showed me. She really does. Brian stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching me hold his daughter. He did not say much. Neither did I. We just stood there in the cold December sun, 3 adults and a tiny baby, while the pigeons pecked at the frozen ground nearby. After a while, I handed Margaret back to Lucy. My arms were getting tired anyway. Brian cleared his throat and said, "Dad, I found a job. Maintenance at the marina. Megan hired me. It is not much, but it covers rent." I looked at him. He had changed out of that ratty jacket into a proper work coat. The sleeves were rolled up, and there was a smudge of grease on his wrist. He looked like he had been working hard. "Good," I said. "You will learn a lot from Megan. She knows more about diesel engines than most Navy chiefs I served with." Brian laughed. It was a small laugh, quiet and a little embarrassed, but it was real. The baby started to fuss, so Lucy turned and walked back toward the gate. Brian followed, then stopped and looked over his shoulder. "Dad, the museum called me. They said you volunteered to give a talk next month about the Normandy navigation gear." I shrugged. I said I would think about it. Brian smiled. "Well, if you do it, let me know. I would like to bring Margaret. She will be bigger by then." I nodded. He turned and walked through the gate to join Lucy. The three of them moved slowly down the path toward the parking lot, the baby's blue blanket bright against the gray winter sky. I sat back down on the garden bench and watched them go. The pigeons returned to peck at the frozen crumbs I had scattered. Overhead, a plane from Logan Airport banked low over the river, its landing lights blinking through the afternoon haze. My phone buzzed one more time. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was the museum again. The archivist wanted to confirm the date for the talk. I typed back a quick reply. January 15th, 10 in the morning. I would be there. I put the phone away and sat for a long while, just watching the river. The bluefin's silhouette was visible from the garden if you knew where to look, a dark shape against the gray water. She was not going anywhere. Neither was I. The nursing home Christmas tree was still lit in the common room window. I could see the colored lights blinking through the glass. Somewhere inside, someone was playing a tinny recording of Silent Night. I listened to it for a while, feeling the cold work its way through my coat. Then I stood up, brushed the crumbs off my lap, and walked inside for dinner. January came in cold and gray. The kind of cold that seeped through windows and settled into your bones no matter how many layers you wore. I spent most of the first week in the nursing home common room, going over my notes for the museum talk. The archivist had sent me a folder full of old photographs and technical diagrams, and I spread them out on the card table by the fireplace. Old Tom wheeled over every afternoon to ask questions. Most of them were about the war, but some of them were about Brian. "Heard your boy is working at the marina now," Tom said, puffing on an inhaler between words. "That true?" I nodded. Brian had been on the maintenance crew for 3 weeks. Megan told me he showed up on time every day, did the dirty jobs without complaining, and had already learned how to rebuild a fuel injector. She said he was quiet, but he worked hard. "That is good," Tom said. "Takes a man to swallow his pride and start over." I did not answer. I was looking at a photograph of the navigation console I had donated to the museum. The brass fittings were tarnished in the picture, but I remembered polishing them every morning during the crossing to Europe. The ship had been a converted trawler, just like the Bluefin, with a crew of 17 and a cargo hold full of spare radio parts. We had sailed through a storm that lasted 4 days. The waves were so high you could not see the horizon, but the navigation gear held steady, and we made landfall on the morning of the 5th day, right where we were supposed to be. The archivist had asked me to talk about that, about the equipment and the men who used it. I had said yes, but now that the date was getting closer, I was not so sure. I had not talked about the war in decades. Some things were easier to keep locked up. The day before the talk, Brian called me. It was the first time he had called since Christmas. "Dad, Lucy and I were thinking, maybe we could come to the museum tomorrow, just to watch. Margaret is doing better. She is putting on weight, and the doctor said she can go out for short trips now." I told him that would be fine. He said he would bring coffee. I said I preferred tea. He laughed and said he remembered the museum was a converted warehouse on the waterfront, with tall windows that faced the harbor and a creaky wooden floor that smelled of old rope and linseed oil. I arrived early, before the staff had even unlocked the front doors. The archivist let me in through the side entrance and showed me to the room where the talk would take place. It was a small auditorium with folding chairs and a podium at the front. On the wall behind the podium hung a large map of the English Channel, marked with the routes of the Normandy invasion fleet. I stood in front of that map for a long time, looking at the dotted lines and the little red arrows. My hands were shaking. I put them in my pockets and waited. The audience started filing in at 9:30. Mostly older folks, some with walkers and canes, a few younger history buffs with notebooks. I spotted Megan in the third row, wearing her red Marina jacket. She gave me a thumbs up. A few rows back, I saw old Tom, parked in his wheelchair near the aisle. Then I saw Brian. He came in through the back door carrying a baby carrier in one hand and a paper cup of tea in the other. Lucy followed with a diaper bag over her shoulder. They found seats near the middle, and Brian set the carrier down carefully on the floor beside his chair. I could see a tiny hand waving from inside the carrier, wrapped in blue wool. The archivist introduced me. I walked up to the podium and looked out at the faces. There were maybe 40 people in the room. The overhead lights were warm and yellow, and the windows showed the gray January sky over the harbor. That I cleared my throat. Good morning. My name is Frank Harper. Most of you know that already, or you would not be here. A few people laughed. I relaxed a little. I'm going to talk about navigation instruments today, I said. The kind that got ships across the ocean before GPS and satellite tracking. The kind I used when I was young and dumb and thought I was invincible. I pulled out the first photograph and held it up. It showed the navigation console of a converted trawler with brass dials and a heavy compass gimbal mounted on the bulkhead. This is the setup we had on the USS Harvester in 1944. She was a fishing boat before the war, just like the Bluefin. They put a radio room in the old fish hold and mounted the navigation gear on the deck above. It was not pretty, but it worked. I talked for about 45 minutes. I talked about the storms and the fog and the nights when you could not see the stars. I talked about the men who kept the equipment running, who repaired broken antennas with spare wire and baling twine. I talked about the day we made landfall at Omaha Beach, 2 weeks after the initial invasion, carrying a cargo of replacement radio parts and a dozen fresh-faced sailors who had never seen combat. Most of those boys were scared, I said. I was scared too. But the compass did not lie. The instruments did not care about fear. They just pointed north, and we followed them. When I finished, there was silence for a moment. Then the archivist started clapping, and everyone else joined in. I stepped down from the podium and went to the side table where they had set up a pitcher of water. My throat was dried up. Brian came up to me while I was pouring a glass. He had the baby carrier in one hand, and he set it on the table next to me. Margaret was awake, her eyes wide and unblinking, staring at the ceiling lights. Dad, Brian said, that was really good. I never knew any of that. You never told me. I took a sip of water. You never asked. He did not argue with that. He just stood there, looking at the baby, looking at me. Lucy came over and put a hand on his arm. She looked at me and smiled, a real smile, not the polite kind she used to wear. We are glad we came, she said. The archivist came over and shook my hand. Mr. Harper, we have had a request from the Port Authority. They want to know if you would consider running a similar talk for the school groups that visit the Bluefin. They are offering a small honorarium. I looked at Brian. He shrugged, like it was up to me. I will think about it. I said that after the museum closed, we walked down to the waterfront together. Brian pushed the baby stroller, and Lucy walked beside him. I walked on the other side, keeping my hands in my pockets. The wind was bitter cold, but the sun had come out from behind the clouds, and the harbor looked almost cheerful. We stopped at the Bluefin's dock. She was tied up at slip 3 now, right where she belonged. The museum had already installed a small interpretive sign on the dock, with a photograph of the ship from 1987 and a paragraph about her history. A few seagulls perched on her bow railing, watching us with tilted heads. Brian stood beside me at the edge of the dock. Can I go aboard? I looked at him. He was not a boy anymore, but the question had the same earnest quality it had when he was 12. I nodded. Go ahead. Just do not touch the compass. It is original. Brian stepped onto the Bluefin's deck carefully, like he was walking on glass. He moved to the wheelhouse door and peered inside. Lucy followed with the stroller, stopping at the gangway. She looked at the Bluefin's hull and then at me. "It is beautiful," she said. "I never really understood why you kept it all these years. I mean, it was just a rusty old boat. But now I get it." I did not say anything. I watched Brian climb into the wheelhouse and run his hand along the brass compass housing. He was being careful, respectful. He looked around at the gauges and the old radio equipment, and he touched nothing. After a few minutes, he came back out. His eyes were a little wet, though it could have been the wind. "Dad," he said, "can we bring Margaret here when she is older to see this place?" I looked at the stroller. The baby was sleeping now, her face peaceful and pink under the blue blanket. Somewhere in the distance, a harbor tugboat blew its horn. "I think that would be all right," I said. We walked back up the dock together. Brian pushed the stroller with one hand and kept the other in his pocket. Lucy walked beside him, her head down against the wind. I followed a few steps behind, watching the three of them move together. At the parking lot, Brian stopped and turned to face me. "Lucy and I were talking. We want to have dinner with you. At the new apartment. It is nothing fancy, but we can cook. Maybe next weekend." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I nodded. "I will bring the pie." Brian smiled. "You still make that apple pie with the crumb topping, your grandmother's recipe," I said. "I have not made it in years. But I can remember." Lucy laughed. "We will hold you to that, Dad. Next Saturday, 6 o'clock. I will send you the address." They got into their car, a beat-up sedan with a dent in the rear bumper. Brian waved as he pulled out of the lot. I watched the taillights disappear around the corner. Then I walked back to the Bluefin and stood on her deck for a while, just looking at the harbor. The wind was cold, but I did not feel it. My hands were steady. My back was straight. The old boat rocked gently against her lines, and I thought about my mother's knitting needles clicking in the quiet of the townhouse porch, and about Margaret's tiny hand waving from the stroller, and about a 12-year-old boy who had asked me a question I was finally ready to answer. I stayed until the sun went down. Then I walked back to the nursing home, slow and steady, one step at a time. The next Saturday came faster than I expected. I spent the morning in the nursing home kitchen, making the apple pie from my mother's recipe. The cook helped me peel the apples and measure the cinnamon. She asked if I was going somewhere special, and I said yes. My son's place. She smiled and said that was nice. I drove the old Ford through the Dorchester streets, past rows of three-decker houses with front porches and chain-link fences. The neighborhood was worn around the edges, but the people on the sidewalks nodded at each other, and kids played stickball in the empty lots. Brian's apartment was on the second floor of a yellow house with a fire escape on the front. The doorbell was broken, so I knocked. Lucy opened the door. She was wearing an apron with a flour smudge on the front, and her hair was pulled back in a ponytail. Behind her, I could hear a baby crying and a pot clattering on the stove. "Dad, come in," she said, stepping aside. "Brian is in the living room. Margaret is having a meltdown, but we will get her settled." I walked in and looked around. The apartment was small, with a narrow kitchen and a living room that held a couch, a second-hand coffee table, and a pack-and-play in the corner. Brian was on the floor trying to soothe Margaret, who was red-faced and wailing. He looked up and gave me a helpless shrug. "Teething," he said. "She has been like this all day." I set the pie on the kitchen counter and walked over to the pack-and-play. Margaret was lying on her back, kicking her little feet and crying with her whole body. I reached down and picked her up. She was light and warm, and her tiny fingers grabbed at my shirt collar. "Shoo," I said. "Easy now. Grandpa has got you." Margaret stopped crying for a second, looked at me with her blurry newborn eyes, and then let out a single hiccup. She did not cry again. She just stared up. Brian stared too. "Dad, how did you do that?" I shrugged. "Babies like steady hands. They can feel when you are nervous." I settled Margaret against my shoulder and patted her back gently. "Your mother taught me that. She used to walk you around the house for hours when you were fussy." Brian got up off the floor and brushed off his knees. He looked at me holding his daughter, and his expression softened. "I do not remember that." "You were too young," I said. "But I remember." Lucy came out of the kitchen with a pot of spaghetti sauce and set it on the dining table. The table was small, covered with a red checkered cloth and set for three. She had put a high chair at one end with a little stuffed whale tied to the seat. "We are keeping it simple," she said. "Spaghetti and meatballs. I hope you like it." I sat down at the table with Margaret still in my arms. She had fallen asleep against my chest, her tiny fist curled around my thumb. Lucy brought the food out, and Brian opened a bottle of cheap red wine. He poured 3 glasses and set one in front of me. "To new beginnings," Brian said, raising his glass. I raised mine too. Lucy clinked her glass against ours. The wine was a little sweet, but it was warm going down. Over dinner, we talked about ordinary things. Brian told me about the maintenance work at the marina. He was learning to weld, he said, and Megan was teaching him how to read the old mechanical schematics. Lucy had found a part-time job at a daycare center 2 blocks from the apartment. She said it was good because she could bring Margaret with her. "Things are coming together," Brian said, twirling spaghetti on his fork. "It is not what we planned, but it is not bad." I nodded and took a bite of the meatballs. They were good, seasoned with garlic and oregano. Lucy watched me eat like she was waiting for approval. "These are good," I said. "Your grandmother used to make them similar, but she put more parsley." Lucy smiled. "I will remember that for next time." After dinner, we moved to the living room. I sat on the couch with Margaret still asleep in my lap. Brian sat on the floor across from me, his back against the coffee table. Lucy curled up in the armchair with a cup of tea. The apartment was warm. The radiator ticked softly in the corner, and the streetlight outside cast a yellow glow through the thin curtains. For a long moment, no one spoke. "Dad," Brian said finally, "I want to apologize. For everything. The house, the boat, the way I treated you all those years. I was greedy. I was stupid. I listened to the wrong people." I looked at him. He was not crying, but his voice was tight. His hands were clasped together between his knees. "You are not the first person to make a mistake," I said, "and you will not be the last. The important thing is what you do after." Brian nodded. Lucy reached over and squeezed his shoulder. I shifted Margaret to my other arm. She stirred but did not wake. "Your mother would have been proud of you," I said. "She always said you had a good heart. It just got buried for a while." Brian looked down at his hands. "Do you think she would have forgiven me?" "She would have," I said. "She forgave everyone. That was her way." Lucy set her tea down and came over to sit on the arm of the couch. She looked at Margaret in my arms and said, "We want to do better, Dad. For her. For ourselves. That is the truth." I looked at the 3 of them. Brian on the floor, Lucy on the couch arm, the baby asleep in my lap. They were a family. A broken one that had been glued back together in a rough way, but a family nonetheless. "I know you will," I said. The night grew later. Lucy made coffee, and we drank it with the leftover pie. It was not the best pie I had ever made. The crust was a little tough, and the apples were too sweet. But no one complained. Brian ate 2 slices, and Lucy said it was the best she had ever had. I thought about my mother's kitchen in the townhouse, the smell of cinnamon and butter, the way she used to flour the countertop until it was white as snow. She had taught me to bake that pie when I was 10 years old. I had not thought about that day in decades. Before I left, Brian walked me down to the car. The night air was cold and clear, and the stars were out over the rooftops. We stood by the old Ford for a moment. "Dad," Brian said, "I want to ask you something. Would you ever consider moving out of the nursing home, not back to the townhouse? I know that is rented, but maybe something smaller, closer to us. There is a studio on the next block. I saw it for rent a few weeks ago." I looked at him. The nursing home was fine. The staff were kind, and old Tom was good company. But I had been there for 7 years, and the walls were starting to feel close. "I will think about it," I said. Brian smiled. "That is what you always say." "Because I always mean it." He laughed. "Come on, Dad. At least let me help you pack." The next morning, I called the nursing home administrator and asked about the procedure for a partial move. She said I could keep my room for a while and come back whenever I wanted. I called Brian and told him I would take the studio for a 6-month trial. He said he would help me paint it. The studio was small, just a single room with a kitchenette and a bathroom. But it had big windows that faced the harbor, and from the fire escape, you could see the bluefin's mast poking up above the roof lines. Brian and Lucy helped me move my things in. They brought a couch from a thrift store and a bookshelf for my Navy books. Margaret spent the whole day in her baby carrier on the floor, watching us work. When everything was arranged, I sat on the new couch and looked around. The walls were bare, but I had my medals on the mantelpiece. My mother's knitting needles were in a jar on the kitchen counter. A framed photograph of the bluefin hung above the bed. It was not much, but it was mine. That spring, the bluefin opened for public tours. The museum sent school groups 3 times a week, and I gave talks in the wheelhouse to kids who had never seen a real compass before. Megan kept the exhibition zone running like a well-oiled machine. The revenue from the subleases covered all the maintenance costs and left a healthy surplus. Brian got promoted to lead mechanic at the marina. Lucy started taking night classes to get her early childhood certification. Margaret grew fast. By the time the cherry trees bloomed on the esplanade, she was sitting up on her own and grabbing at anything within reach. That one Sunday afternoon in May, Brian brought her down to the Bluefin. I was in the wheelhouse, checking the oil levels, when I heard footsteps on the gangway. Margaret's voice was babbling away in that happy baby way, and Brian was laughing. "Dad," he called, "we brought lunch. Sandwiches from that deli you like." I climbed out of the wheelhouse and found Brian on the dock, holding Margaret on his hip. She was wearing a little blue sundress and a sun hat with a chin strap. When she saw me, she shrieked and waved her chubby arms. That I took her from Brian and held her up so she could see the harbor. The water was glittering in the afternoon sun. A few sailboats were out, their white canvas bright against the blue. A tugboat chugged past, its horn tooting a friendly note. "Look at that, Maggie," I said, using the nickname that had stuck. "All that water, all those boats. One day, you are going to sail on all of them." Margaret grabbed my thumb and put it in her mouth. I laughed and pulled it free. Brian unpacked the sandwiches on the dock. Lucy arrived a few minutes later, carrying a thermos of iced tea. We sat on the wooden planks with our backs against the Bluefin's warm hull and ate our lunch while the gulls circled overhead. It was a simple day, a simple meal, nothing expensive or special. But when I looked at Brian and Lucy and Margaret, sitting there on the dock with the sun on their faces and the harbor spread out before them, I felt a warmth that no amount of money could have bought. The old Bluefin rocked gently at her mooring. The navigation gear in her wheelhouse, the same gear that had crossed the English Channel in 1944, was safe and preserved for future generations. The townhouse on Beacon Street was leased to a family with 3 children who played on the front porch every summer. And my mother's knitting needles sat in a jar on my kitchen counter, ready to be passed down when the time was right. I leaned back against the Bluefin's hull and closed my eyes. The wind was warm, the water was calm, and my family was beside me. Life was not perfect. It never was. But it was good. That fall, the museum asked me to write down my memories of the Bluefin and the navigation instruments. I spent a month working on it, typing slowly on an old laptop that Brian had found for me at a yard sale. When I finished, the archivist said they would bind it as a small booklet and sell it in the museum gift shop. I told them to put the proceeds toward the summer youth sailing program. That Margaret turned 1 year old in November. Brian and Lucy threw a small party in their apartment. They invited Megan and old Tom and a few of the marina workers. I brought an apple pie, and this time I got the crust just right. When everyone had gone home and the apartment was quiet, Brian sat down on the couch next to me. Margaret was asleep in her crib, a little stuffed whale tucked under her arm. "Dad," Brian said, "I want to thank you for giving me a second chance, for not giving up on me." I looked at him. The lines on his face were softer now. The gray in his hair was still there, but it looked natural, not stressed. He had found his footing. "You gave yourself a second chance," I said. "I just opened the door." Brian shook his head. "No, you held it open, and you kept holding it, even when I did not deserve it." I put my hand on his shoulder. It was a gesture I had not made in a long time. It felt natural, like it had never stopped feeling that way. "That is what fathers do," I said. Brian nodded. He did not say anything else. He did not have to. The winter passed. The spring came again. The Bluefin's deck got new varnish, and her compass was polished to a high gleam. The school groups kept coming, and I kept telling my stories. Margaret learned to walk, and then to run. She loved the marina. She loved the boats. She loved the gulls. And every Sunday afternoon, weather permitting, I sat on the Bluefin's dock with my family, watching the harbor traffic go by. Some stories end with a bang. But this one did not end that way. It ended with a quiet afternoon, a warm wind, and a little girl in a sun hat, learning to wave at the boats. And that was just fine with me. The end. If you enjoyed Frank Harper's story, I hope you will consider subscribing. There will be more tales from the marina in the months to come, more about the old boats and the people who keep them afloat, and more about the knots that tie families together. The subscription button is right below this line. It does not cost a thing, but it lets an old storyteller know that someone out there is listening. Thank you for reading. See you at the dock.